Hi there, welcome back to English for Specific Purposes, Level B2. We are your hosts, I'm Mr. Deryl.
And I'm Miss Tathia. მოგესალმებით, კეთილი იყოს თქვენი დაბრუნება ჩვენს ტელესკოლაში. მე თათია ვარ, ეს კი დერილია, and the topic of our lesson today is ecology again, right? I think that we are going to talk about very interesting things today. But before we start the lesson, I think it's time to look at our agenda. What's on our agenda today, Mr. Deryl?
As usual, we start out with a discussion, which is our introduction to the topic. We move from there to vocabulary that is related to the reading text that we will eventually do. And from there, we will look at some grammar, finish up with a summary of things, and give out some homework.
Seems interesting. გაკვეთილს როგორც ყოველთვის შესწავლით დავიწყებთ, შემდეგ შევისწავლით ახალ სიტყვებს, რომელიც ეკოლოგიასთან იქნება დაკავშირებული, ასევე წავიკითხავთ ეკოლოგიის თემასთან დაკავშირებულ ტექსტს, შემდეგ განვიხილავთ გრამატიკას, შევაჯამოთ გაკვეთილს და დავასრულებთ საშინაო დავალებით. And now let's start. But before we learn some words, let's talk a little bit about ecology and habitats. Mr. Deryl, so you are our guest to say so, and I know that you have explored Georgia a lot. So what do you know about the habitats in Georgia? I mean, what habitats can be found in Georgia? I mean, are there any forests, deserts, mountain ranges, etc.?
Well, definitely mountain ranges. It's one of the most famous things about this area, the Caucasus Mountains. You've got forested areas as well in certain Borjomi parts and elsewhere.
Yes, you're right.
And I think you have a desert, don't you?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So I think that we have very diverse habitats, and Georgia is really famous for its beautiful landscapes. And a lot of tourists come here to explore these brilliant places, right? And I think that we should take care of these habitats more, right? And should raise people's awareness that we have to look after this beauty we have just been gifted.
So it is important to take care of them, yes.
Okay, now let's move on to the words. Let's learn some words today. And what is the first word, Mr. Deryl?
The first word is a noun, and it is biodiversity.
Biodiversity is a noun, and in Georgian it is translated biomravalperonepa. Mr. Deryl, can you give us more details about the word?
Biodiversity is the number and types of plants and animals that exist in a particular area or environment.
And we have an example here. Scientists are trying to protect species, habitat, and biodiversity. Okay, now let's move on. And the next word we have is habitat. Habitat is a noun, and in Georgian it is translated as ბუნებრივი საარსებო გარემო. And can you give us more details about the word in English, Mr. Deryl?
Yeah, the word habitat, it's the place that an animal or plant exists in and lives in. The usual environment.
And we have an example. With so many areas of woodlands being cut down, a lot of wildlife is losing its natural habitats. Okay, and what is the next word, Mr. Deryl?
It's vegetation. It's a noun, and it is vegetation.
Vegetation is a noun, and in Georgian it is translated as mtsenarეული საფარი. Vegetation. And can you give us English definition of the word, Mr. Deryl?
It can refer to two things. It can refer to plants in general, and it can refer to the plants that are in a specific area.
Okay. And we have an example. Much of the region's native vegetation has been damaged by developers who are building hotels along the coast. That's such a frustrating thing, right?
It's such a destructive thing as well.
Yes, you're right. Okay, the next word we have is
species. It's a noun, and it's pronounced species.
Species is a noun, and in Georgian it is სახეობა, ჯიში, right? Species. And can you give us more details about the word, Mr. Deryl?
Yeah, it's a set of animals or plants that have similar characteristics and can breed with one another.
And we have an example, as usual. Over 100 species of insect are found in this area. And the next word we have is a verb, and it is to conserve. Conserve is a verb and in Georgian it is translated as ბუნების დაცვა. Mr. Deryl, can you give us definition of the word? And I think that this is kind of to protect. Is it the same?
That's right. To keep or to protect something from damage, from waste or change.
Okay. And I have an example here. We must conserve our woodlands for future generations. It's a very good sentence, I think, and we have to take it into consideration, right?
It's something we should do more of.
Yeah, okay. And I think that we have finished with the first set of vocabulary and it's time to practice. We have sentences and we have to choose the right word to complete the sentence.
I'll ask you the first sentence, if you don't mind.
Of course, I'm ready.
Development is destroying the animal's native
habitats. So development is destroying the animal's native habitat, and we've talked about it, right? Okay. Now the second sentence is for you, Mr. Deryl. Desert areas have little. What can go here?
Well, I would say vegetation.
Yes, of course, because there are no plants, no trees. It means that there is no vegetation.
Or very few, very few.
You're right, Mr. Deryl, and it's my turn now. Recycling helps, then there is a gap, natural and often limited resources. So I would say conserve would be the best word here. So the sentence will sound like this. Recycling helps conserve natural and often limited resources. So now it's your turn, Mr. Deryl.
Yeah, my sentence goes like this. The list of endangered something includes nearly 600 fishes.
What do you think can go here?
I would say species.
And you're
let's
right.
check. Yeah, and so it goes like this. The list of endangered species includes nearly 600 fish.
And the last sentence, a very easy task for me, but I will read it. The newcomers can pose a threat to biodiversity by altering ecosystems. And now it's time to move on to the reading part. But before we read the text, I think that we have to do something. What is this something?
Look at the vocabulary.
Yes, you're right, Mr. Deryl. This will help us to understand the text better, right? And the first word we have is greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases, this is a noun, and in Georgian it's translated as satpuris airabi. Mr. Deryl, can you help me with the definition?
Well, these are gases that cause the greenhouse effect, which is what the warming up of the planet, such as carbon dioxide. That's a notable greenhouse gas.
And we have the example here. We need to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 60%. So if we do this, I think that it will be very good for the ecology and ecosystem. Right?
Very beneficial to the planet.
Yeah. Okay. And what is the next word, Mr. Deryl?
It's a noun, carbon footprint. Carbon footprint.
Carbon footprint is a noun, and in Georgian it is translated as satpuris airების საერთო რაოდენობა, რომელიც ატმოსფეროში გაიფრქვევა. A little bit complicated. Will you help me with the definition, Mr. Deryl?
Indeed, it's a measurement. It's a measurement of how much carbon your activities produce.
And for making things clearer, I will give an example. We all need to look for ways to reduce our carbon footprint. So the amount of pollution, I think, right?
And the amount of things we use. Use less water, for example, when you brush your teeth and so on. You can reduce a lot of things everywhere.
Yeah. And what is the next word, Mr. Deryl?
It's a noun as well. Incentive. The incentive.
Incentive. Incentive is a noun, and in Georgian it is translated as stimuli, წახალისება. So what about English definition, Mr. Deryl?
Well, this is something that encourages someone to do something.
And an example here. There is no incentive for people to save fuel. So I think that we have to give incentives to people to save energy and fuel, right?
Yeah, governments are going to have to do this. They're going to have to increase incentives for future generations.
Increase or just introduce?
Even introduce them, yeah.
I would say introduce, right? So the next word is to fell. To fell is a verb, and in Georgian it's translated as ჭრა ჩეხვა. So how would you define that word, Mr. Deryl?
Well, it's a fancy way of saying to cut down a tree.
Okay, and here's an example. A great number of trees were felled to provide space for grazing.
Well, that's good for the animals who are grazing, but probably makes the area look uglier.
Yeah, and the next word we have is...
It's also a noun. Will.
Will. So we have heard, we know the word will, but in different contexts.
Yeah.
But in this case, will is a noun, and the Georgian it means neba, survili. Okay, how would you define that word, Mr. Deryl?
Well, something that someone wants to happen. So it's it's what they're looking forward to.
Desire,
yeah,
kind of.
Desire.
Okay, and I have an example here. It was God's will.
Mm-hmm. People often say that for natural disasters.
Yeah. And what is the next word, Mr. Deryl?
Forestry is a noun, forestry.
Mm. Forestry is a noun, and in Georgian it means metqeveoba. So, can you give us more details about the word, Mr. Deryl?
Mm-hmm. It's basically the science of caring for forests.
Oh, okay, a very, very important science, right? Okay, forestry, a noun, and in Georgian it is metqeveoba. And I have an example here. He studied forestry at Colorado State University. So people study forestry, it turns out, right?
Definitely. We have some questions to talk about before we look at this text.
Yeah.
Thatya, so how important are forests to the ecosystem?
As I know, it's very, very important because scientists talk a lot about how important forests are, and they are even called the lungs of the earth. Mm-hmm, so it means that they are really important.
Places like the
lungs
Amazon.
Are important for our body.
Places like the Amazon, you mean?
Yes, you're right. And what do you know about this topic? Do you know anything?
I think related to the reading task, deforestation is the thing that we should focus on. Will that be one of the main reasons for climate change?
Maybe yes, but I think that we have to read the text and find out more about the importance of forests. Mm-hmm. Let's get started. The accelerating destruction of the rainforest is now being recognized as one of the main causes of climate change. Carbon emissions from deforestation cause much greater damage than planes, automobiles, and even factories. The uncontrolled destruction of tropical forests is second only to the energy sector as a source of greenhouse gases, according to a report published by the Global Canopy Program, an alliance of leading rainforest scientists. Figures show that deforestation accounts for up to 25% of global emissions of heat-trapping gases, while transport and industry account for 14% each, and aviation makes up only 3% of the total.
So we see some statistics on why deforestation is actually quite dangerous.
Yes.
Or destructive.
And we have to move on and find out more about deforestation.
Scientists say one day's deforestation is equivalent to the carbon footprint of 8 million people flying to New York. Reducing those catastrophic emissions can be achieved most quickly and most cheaply by slowing the destruction in Brazil, Indonesia, the Congo, and elsewhere. No new technology is needed, says the GCP. Just the political will and a system of enforcement and incentives that makes the trees worth more to governments and individuals than felled. Most people think of forests only in terms of the CO2 they absorb. The rainforests of the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Indonesia are thought of as the lungs of the planet, as you mentioned. But the destruction of those forests will, in the next 4 years alone, pump more CO2 into the atmosphere than every flight in the history of aviation to at least 2025.
Really, I was sure that aviation and transport cause much more pollution.
That's what I thought as well, and this is surprising.
Really surprising. So, Indonesia became the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world last week. Following close behind is Brazil. Neither nation has heavy industry on a comparable scale with the EU, India, or Russia, and yet they emit more heat-trapping gases than all other countries, except the United States and China. What both countries do have in common are tropical forests that is being cut and burned. According to the figures from 2003, 2 billion tons of CO2 enters the atmosphere every year from deforestation. That destruction amounts to an area the size of England, Wales, and Scotland. Forestry experts and policymakers want to put deforestation on top of the agenda for the UN Climate Summit in Bali, Indonesia this year. Experts think that putting a price on the carbon these vital forests contain is the only way to slow their destruction.
So basically, governments have a huge role to play in this process.
Yes, you're right, Mr. Deryl. And I think that it's time to check how well we remember the text. So for this, we have statements, and we have to decide whether the statements are true or false. Can I be the first?
Yes, let's look at the first sentence. Destruction of the rainforest is the only cause of climate change. True or false?
I think that it must be false. Because I remember we read the accelerating destruction of the rainforests is now being recognized as one of the main causes of climate change. It's not the only cause, right? It's one of them. And now it's your turn, Mr. Deryl, and I will read the statement, and you have to decide whether it's true or false.
I'm ready.
Okay. Destruction of tropical forests is more responsible for climate change than transport industry, which was a surprising fact for us. So what do you think?
Yes, I'm quite sure that that was true.
And you're right, Mr. Deryl, because we read figures show that deforestation accounts for up to 25% of global emissions of heat-trapping gases, while transport and industry account for 14%, and aviation makes up only 3% of the total.
Surprising figures.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm ready to listen to you.
New technology is needed to reduce emissions caused by deforestation.
No, it's false for sure, because I remember that no new technology is needed, says the GCP, just the political will and a system of enforcement and incentives that makes the trees worth more than governments and individuals standing than felt.
So political will more than incentives.
Yeah, you're right. And no new technology is needed to solve this problem, right? And the next one for you, Mr. Deryl, the statement sounds like this. Indonesia and Brazil emit more heat-trapping gases than other countries because they have heavy industry.
See, if I can remember the text properly, it should be false.
And you are right, Mr. Deryl. It's false. And why is it false?
Because the text says the following. Indonesia became the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world last week. Following close behind is Brazil. Neither nation has heavy industry on a comparable scale with the EU, India, or Russia, and yet they emit more heat-trapping gases than all other countries.
And I think that we have finished with the reading part, and it's time to move to grammar. And the grammar topic today is again tense markers, and specifically adverbs as tense markers.
So these tense markers are words or phrases that express the writer's or speaker's feeling and attitude about something.
So we talked about it at the previous
last
lesson,
time,
right?
yeah. For example, when describing a personal experience, certain adverbs usually placed at the beginning of a sentence can be very useful for adding descriptive details and feelings to a piece of writing.
Okay, for example, if I start my sentence with surprisingly, so you expect that I'm going to say something surprising to you, right?
Of course, to me and to you.
Okay, right. Well, for example, surprisingly, 2 billion tons of CO2 enters the atmosphere every year from deforestation. So it was a surprising fact, so I started with the adverb, surprisingly. Or the next example, when I finally met the firefighter who saved the forest, I honestly could not speak. So honestly, I use honestly here to say that I'm speaking frankly, right?
And the last example?
Yes, there was a fire in the nearby village. Luckily, the firefighters managed to put out the fire. So if I start the sentence with luckily, so you know that something good happened at the end,
something
right?
fortunate.
Okay, fortunate thing. And now I think it's time to practice. We have sentences, 2 options of adverbs, and we have to choose the best one here, right? So the first example is the following. We have a blank space at the beginning, then the damage was not serious. If the damage was not serious, it's a good thing. So I have 2 options, seriously and luckily. So I would choose definitely luckily here, because it's a good thing, right?
True.
Now it's your turn, Mr. Derill.
Let's look at the next sentence. We have a space at the beginning, then a comma. The government agreed to impose more regulations straight away. No one expected it. Now,
so if no one expected it, it's something surprising.
And we have 2 choices. We have surprisingly and honestly, obviously surprisingly.
You're right, Mr. Derill. Okay, now the next example for me. Again, the sentence starts with a gap, a blank space. Then that's all we can do to save the planet. So let me think. I would choose honestly here, right? And say honestly, that's all we can do to save the planet.
You're admitting that that's the thing that can be done.
Yeah, that's the only thing that can be done. Now, your turn, Mr. Derill.
We have another space at the beginning of this sentence, and it continues with, the stormy waves cause little damage to the boat. We have 2 choices,
so
sadly.
If the damage was a little, so it's a good thing.
It would have to be, similarly to luckily, fortunately.
Yes, you're right, Mr. Derill. Fortunately, the stormy waves caused little damage to the boat. And I think that we have finished with everything today, and it's time to wrap up the lesson.
As you remember, Ms. Thათია, we spoke about vocabulary words relevant to the reading text. We looked at the reading text, and then we did grammar, which was specifically adverbs as stance markers.
A very interesting lesson, right? And I think that it's time to move to the homework, Mr. Derill. What are we going to have as a homework?
We have spent a lot of time speaking about forests, and we'd like for you to answer the following question. Write about the importance of forests for ecosystems.
Okay, and can a sample be found anywhere, Mr. or where the homework should be uploaded and where the sample can be found?
Yes, so conveniently, it's on the screen right now, and if people follow that link, they can find a place to upload the homework and to find a sample answer.
Very interesting. Okay, and now I think that we have to say goodbye to the viewers, and but we will meet them for sure with some more interesting topics.
We're saying goodbye to the topic as well, you're right, and we're going on to a new topic next.
Yes. Okay, so stay with us and keep on learning. Until next week, goodbye. Bye.